From the National Christian Foundation in San Diego, I'm Kim Moeller, and this is the Generous Girl Podcast, a show that shares inspirational stories about generosity through faith, family, finances, fitness, and friendships, as well as deep thoughts about what matters most and practical tips. My guests are all amazing women who have overcome adversity and are big believers in hope and in maximizing their time, their talents, and their treasures, and making their lives count. So we're so happy that you're here. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Generous Girl Podcast. I'm really excited to introduce you today to my guest, Audra Ames. Audra is a certified financial planner, and she lives in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I know you're going to be thrilled to hear her story. I will let her tell the details, but suffice it to say, she also has a real heart for widows, as our prior podcast guest, Janice Thompson, did. And you will see why when you hear her story. So welcome, Audra. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, Kim.
Yes, I love that we met through a mutual friend on Zoom, and I thought listening to you and your story would be wonderful to have you as a guest. So I really appreciate your time and being here today.
Of course. It's just such a blessing, and I'm grateful to just share my story, which is other widows' stories as well, and just really God's hope in the way that He can restore your heart after you've gone through a loss.
Well, we are all grateful, and I know people will be so blessed by your story. So let's start with talking about what part of the country did you grow up in? You know, as I said, you're in the Midwest now, but where'd you grow up? And then where did you meet Scott, your husband?
Yes. So I grew up about 2.5 hours west of here in central Illinois. It's a small farm town called Leroy, about 4,000 people, which was a really cool place to grow up. Everyone knew everyone, went to kindergarten through 12th grade with the same people. So it was just awesome to, you grew up with the same people, and it was just such a blessing. So went to, I was about 20 miles from Illinois State and about the same from the University of Illinois over in central Illinois. And so when it came time to go to college, I was like, man, like, I love you all, but I've already done 12 years with you. I kind of want to go do something else and just kind of get out of central Illinois. So I ended up just going about 2 hours east of home to Indiana State University. So it was just far enough where I told Mom she couldn't just meet me for dinner, but it was also close enough where I could go home on a Friday night for the weekends. And I wasn't too far. So was at Indiana State. I transferred there my last 2 years, did just a small junior college. My first two, just stayed close to home, saved some money. And then it was the last semester of college at a bar that I met Scott. So he came up to me, and the funny story about it is that I had already gotten my full-time job at Vallejo, where I'm at now. And he was already commissioned to be a pilot in the Air Force. And so I met him at a time where I was like, I'm not dating anybody. Like, I've got this 5-year plan of my career, and I'm going to be doing all these things. And like, I'm not getting married. I'm not having kids. And then, of course, as God always does, he was like, well, actually, I have a different plan for you. And so Scott came up to me at a bar and went on a date. I think it was 2 days later. And we just never stopped hanging out after that.
Wow. And then, if I remember correctly, you ended up in the South. One of my daughters went to school in Alabama. So we became familiar with grits and sweet iced tea. And those kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah. So Scott, he was stationed down at Columbus Air Force Base in Columbus, Mississippi. And so we had a beautiful river home down there, moved kind of in the heart of COVID in May about 2020, I'm sorry. And so I lived down there for about 1.5 years or 2 years, kind of through his passing and then after as well.
Okay, so you dated then how long? And then you just mentioned his passing. So, and you did say at the beginning that you are a widow. And so that is your story that we really want the listeners to be able to hear, because you were widowed at such a young age. And all of our hearts do go out to you. You're such a strong woman, and I'm just so proud of you and your faith. But so you dated, was it 3 years?
So we dated for 2. Yep. So we dated for 2. Most of it was long distance. I was working up here in Indianapolis while Scott was in pilot training down here or down in Mississippi. I'm not there anymore. But the way that works really with pilot training, and I won't get too Air Force on the podcast,
Sure.
but basically, there's a few different bases that pilots or aspiring pilots will go to get trained to go either fly fighter jets or kind of the heavy jets, which think are the big, they look like commercial jets. So there's the 135, which is pretty common. It's the refueling plane. You've got the C-17, which just hauls a lot of cargo everywhere. And so you really kind of go those two paths. You either go fly F-16s or F-22s, which are your fighter jets, or the heavies. And so to do that, though, you have to go through pilot training. So it's about a year and a half of just vigorous studying and flying. And I mean, Scott was just doing 12-hour days of, he would go fly, 2 flights, and he'd study, and we'd FaceTime for about 30 minutes. And I was working, studying for the CFP up here in Indy. And we'd try to meet up halfway every month or two and hang out for a weekend and just made it work until we got to be in Mississippi together.
And then if you're comfortable talking about what happened, you were married just a number of months. And what happened? Yeah.
So May of 2020, kind of like I mentioned earlier, we both get to Mississippi. So he'd been at instructor training in San Antonio for about a year, 8 months to a year. I can't remember exactly. And then he was an instructor at Columbus Air Force Base. So his role was teaching students to fly the T-38. It's a training jet. And so it's really the precursor to any sort of fighter jet that anyone would get to fly. And so he, again, was just working those long hour days for about 8 months. He'd, be flying with students, and then he'd help them afterwards. And Scott was just the type of person that he made everybody, and I know everyone says this about people that have died, but he really was the light of the room, and he made every single person feel like his best friend. And so he humbly, I didn't find out any of this till after he passed, but he won the instructor award his first kind of quarter as an instructor from the students, because everyone just loved him so much and just always felt so welcomed by him. And he would stay late to help them learn things and help them clean up the squadron or just different things like that. But he just had such the bubbly personality, and he lived every day like his last. So his colleagues loved to fly with him. His students loved to fly with him, which made his days long, unfortunately, for me to get to see him. But it was such an honor to share him with the Air Force. So for 8 months, we were just living the dream. We eloped at the courthouse a few weeks after he got to Mississippi. And so we had just 8 months of just lovely wedded time and time together after 2 years apart. And then the morning of February 19th, 2021, he went to work like he did every day. He'd had the week off prior. It had snowed, and we'd got to, I look back now, and it was such a blessing from God that we got to spend that week together, not knowing what was going to happen on Friday. And so it was just, again, just such a blessing that, it had snowed and we got to spend time together, because I can't imagine looking back now had we not gotten that time. So he went to work, and they were doing what's called a cross country. So they were flying from Mississippi to Florida. It's kind of like the movies, but it's not. About 8 p.m. that night, they were at my door to tell me that he had died in a plane accident.
As an instructor, as a training instructor. It's just so hard. And my heart goes out to you. And I know, it's a few months in couple of years later, but I'm sure every time you retell the story, it's got to be still very, very challenging. So, and again,
it is. And I've told people many times that in grief, time feels just like it doesn't make sense, because on one hand, it feels like just yesterday that I got to hug him and talk to him and see him. But it's been, over 2.5 years. And so it's like, how has it been so long? But also it just feels like yesterday at the same time. And I hope it always feels like that, just so I never forget him. It's definitely, it can be challenging for sure from day to day.
Well, and I think that, you hear those stories of people who almost die on the operating table and go up to heaven for a second and come back. And they do seem to say that once they met people or saw people, that no time had passed. And so I do think that
is how we're all going to feel. And maybe we'll all look like we were 18 again.
Yeah, I was listening to a sermon not too long ago, and they were talking about like, what you're going to look like or what you're going to be like up in heaven. And the pastor was like, I honestly don't know. Like, you could be young and athletic with long blonde hair, or
Right.
I don't know. Like, maybe it's your best self. I don't know what we're going to look like.
I'm believing it's your best self. That's what I'm going for.
Yeah. Or like, do you see people as you remember them, or is
Right.
it, how they really are? I don't know. But
Who knows? Who knows? Okay, so you already were a certified financial planner prior to that happening, and now
Yes.
you find yourself a widow and no children.
Correct.
And then you end up going back to Indianapolis and with the firm that you were with. But I know prior to us talking right now and recording, you were talking about how this really has given you a heart for widows and just the grieving process and understanding it. So let's unpack that a little bit more and how that going through what you've gone through has really directed your current, career and profession.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I've spoken to this with so many people, that at some point in all of our lives, we go through an event, and whether that's loss or an affair or a job loss or a divorce, anything, right? We all, I think, at some point go through an event in our lives, and God will use that if we let Him to really use our purpose and find our purpose in life. And, prior to Scott dying, I'd never lost anybody. And so I kind of look back and I sometimes feel ignorant for the way that I talk to people that I knew that had, and like the platitudes that I said that I know now are not helpful, or kind of the bias that we have sometimes where it's like, oh, a year's gone by, they're fine. And, their grief is better now and time heals all wounds. And that's just not true. And so I think, there was a time, if you'll allow me to share the story, I went to a widow's retreat about a year after Scott passed. It was actually the following week after the 1-year anniversary of his passing. And I had the blessing to go to this widow's retreat. And so Scott's favorite song was Alan Jackson's Chattahoochee. And this retreat was down in Atlanta. And so on my way home, I'm going over the Chattahoochee River. And I just remember thinking like there was just so much goodness that God had poured into it. Was just 400 widows. And I remember praying in the car, and I was like, man, like that was just a lot of like really good things. But sometimes when there's a lot of good things, it's overwhelming. And I remember thinking like, I just don't know how to feel right now. Cause I'm like, I've just up until that point been so angry, and I was angry with God, and I was angry with everything that Scott had died. And I'm like, I just don't know what the future looks like. Like, I just don't understand. And I just was praying, and I go over the Chattahoochee, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of odd. Like, I didn't realize I was going to be driving over that. And I just kind of had this moment of God and Scott, and I like to think it's both of them speaking with me. And they were like, Audra, like, you cannot end your life. And by end, I mean just being sad and grieving and not doing anything joyful. Like, you can't do that to yourself because Scott died. Because that's not how he lived. And that's not God's purpose for you to just sit here and be sad all the time. And like, yeah, you have to grieve and you have to feel it, but you can't sit in that forever. And I just remember just feeling this moment from God where he was like, Audra, like you like to talk, you like to write, like you have to share and be courageous enough to share what you've gone through, because it's not just your story, it's other widows' stories that have gone through it. And like, you have to do that, not only for you, but because that's how Scott lived his life. And that's how he also lives on. He doesn't live on by you crying in your room and being sad all the time. And so kind of from that moment on, I remember thinking like, I do have to share my story in grief, and I do have to connect with other widows, and I do have to try to make the world a little bit brighter, and not only for me, but for other people. And so then when I came back to Indy to work, I really reevaluated the clients that I wanted to serve. And I obviously really understand the widow heart because I am one. And I just thought to myself, every day is a blessing. And Scott lived every day like it was his last. And I don't know when my day is. And so there are other people that are going to serve other clients, but I just really want to serve the widows and the divorced women and the women that have gone through a life transition, and just really focus on helping them.
That's so beautiful. I mean, just the phrase, using beauty from ashes as God restores things, and your hurt then ends up helping someone else, and your pain begins to, that purpose that comes from it to help others is really beautiful. And you're absolutely right, because if we stay in that, wallowing or depression or just the sadness of things when they don't go according to our plan, or something just shocking as what you had happened to you just really derails us. I mean, I think it's really great to point out that took a year of you feeling that way and being angry. And it's, as we know, God, like we look at David and all kinds of people in the Bible, and they were angry with God. So he's very used to it. But, sometimes we're just not able to move out of that place to the next, phase of grief and healing. And then, like you said, kind of when you can recognize that, you're ready to just take that next step and realize that anger is that secondary emotion, and what's underneath it, it's hurt. And so how am I going to handle this? And I mean, did you have any counselors that helped you walk through this process, or girlfriends, or what did you feel was like your support system?
Yeah, I did. So the top support system that I had was just the other military widows. And the blessing is that, the blessing and the curse of the situation is the military accidents are very, very public. So when a plane like this crashes and people perish, it is on people.com and it's on militarytimes.com. And I mean, everyone knows, which is its own grief thing to process in and of itself, because you just have a ton of people that are having their opinions on the situation and whatnot. But the blessing of that, though, is that all of these other widows that have gone through that know who you are. And so they reach out. And so thankfully for me, I really didn't have to try to find that group of women. They just really rallied behind me, which is just such a blessing from God. And when you have people in your corner that have gone through what you go through, it really does help. And I've told people that every grief story and loss, whether that's the loss of a marriage or a loss of a spouse or a child or a parent or just the life that you thought you were going to live, it is so unique. And like another widow who lost her husband in a T-38, her grief journey and story is still so different than mine, even though it's the same thing, right? And so I think it's okay to feel alone in your stories just for a little bit, because you are alone in your story, because it's very unique. But you do also have to know that there are people that have gone through something so similar that can empathize with you. And so I think that's so helpful to just find that, whether you kind of have to look for it or hopefully those people can come to you. So that was really the main kind of support system that I had. But then also, obviously, just kind of being courageous enough to go to therapy. And I do think that can be tough sometimes, because you don't just meet the first therapist and tell them your story and it's a great fit, right? So having the courage to continue to try new things and try new people. And it is hard to have to tell your story over and over again until you finally find that fit. But definitely taking the steps out, every week or month or however long it takes to do that, I think is so important, to just kind of have that third party person that obviously that's their job to know how your brain works and be able to help you through that. But also just someone too, I think it's meaningful to have someone that doesn't know anything about the Air Force, or doesn't know anything about your family, or doesn't know anything about any of your life, that can just be really unbiased and just helping.
Sounding board, reflecting, remembering what you might have shared 6 months earlier and how you've grown, and encourage you that way. One of my youngest child just recently in the spring graduated with her clinical mental health counseling degree. So she's now going, she's begun her practice and is working on getting all of her 2,000 hours, and super proud of her. Okay, so the two pillars that we're focused on in this podcast are family and finances. So obviously the family piece and how you have overcome adversity, or I'm sure every day still overcoming adversity with this type of a challenge. We've touched upon that, but let's talk also more about the finances side, and talk to the listener about, like, you had your CFP certification when you passed away. Did you have all your papers? Because like on the last podcast, Janice talked about you need your essential team of people around you. You need your essential papers. And she went through and listed a number of like your power of attorney for your
Yep.
financial documents and your medical. So let's help the listener from the practical side of what happened in that situation, and maybe some of your learnings would help other people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will first start by saying that when you take the CFP, they kind of tell you that, well, if you're married and you don't have kids and you don't have significant assets, like you really don't need an estate plan. And unfortunately, Scott and I, we got married, we eloped, right? And then he was flying all the time, and it just was not at the top of our to-do list to get estate planning documents done because we did not have significant wealth at all. I think our net worth was probably $1,000 at the time. And we didn't have kids. And so it was like, well, we don't really need them and nothing's going to happen to us. We're 24 years old.
Right.
Unfortunately, things do happen. And so we didn't have power of attorneys. We didn't have wills. We didn't have healthcare power of attorneys. Nothing. And so the military does facilitate a bit with the funeral. So they paid for a large chunk of it. But then also they have the people that they do autopsy, they do transportation, they do all of that. And then you basically just tell them, hey, this is what his wishes were and this is what we want to do, which in and of itself is stressful. But when it came to the estate plan, all those other things, I now have to go through probate. And so I don't know if Janice touched on probate, but probate is essentially the process of you go to the courts in the county and state that you live, and you have to prove to them that you are the heir of the person that died. And then you die. So Scott died what's called intestate, meaning that because he didn't have a will, his assets passed based on Mississippi state law. That's where we were married. That's where our residence was.
Right.
That's where all of our assets were. And so we had to go through what Mississippi state law said. So had we had kids, they would have inherited some of the assets as well, which would have been a bit difficult as the spouse to take care of, the children. But thankfully in Mississippi, the spouse gets everything. But it was quite the experience going to, paying an attorney a few $1,000s to go to court, and I have to sit there and testify, and there's a couple arguing in the back about getting divorced at the same time that I'm up there testifying about Scott and I's marriage. And so it's questions like, how long did you date, and how long were you together, and how long were you married, and what date did you get married, and where did you get married, and did you have kids, and what was your address? And I mean, it was just a lot of those things.
Sure you're the legitimate spouse of that person, and it's not some fraudulent person trying to claim his estate. And all that time, energy, like you said, the money to the attorney.
Yep. Yeah. And it's definitely more of just an emotional burden, right? I mean, it was so easy in our case because there was no, you have to do the notice to heirs and the notice to creditors, which is a 90-day waiting period. So you basically, the state has to say, hey, if there are any creditors of, Scott Ames that no one, that maybe the spouse doesn't know about, that he owes them money, had he had a personal loan somewhere and they wanted to get paid from that, then you have to wait 90 days. Or, had there been a kid somewhere or another wife, I don't know, right? Then they have to have time to come forward for that. But it's just it's just a really heavy emotional thing to have to sit through. And when you're going through grief like that, that's just one of those things that is, if you can avoid it, you should. And so the estate plan is so important, but also not only for the people that remain, but also for your wishes. If you want to be cremated or you want to be buried, then you can notify that. Or if you, want to give someone a piece of jewelry or, things like that. It's just really important to have those wishes stated. And typically in any state, you can have an attorney draft those documents for a flat fee that's really affordable and can save you a lot of time and definitely your loved ones and just that emotional energy having to go through that process.
So how does that look then for a client who comes into your office? How did you structure things a little bit differently from your own learnings to save that person the grief, that you had to experience?
Yeah. So I'll say, and I have to preface this, that these are my things, not my company's things that I'm going to say. But I definitely now, when I consult with people, I just tell them my story. And I'm like, this is why this is so important. And, I only can give you advice. Whether you do it or not is up to you, obviously. But I think a lot of people have been really receptive to just seeing the real life thing, because I think a lot of times, especially as young people, when you think of dying, like Scott and I we did not ever think this was going to happen, right? And we thought, death is something you think about when you're 80 years old. And I think for a lot of young people, and we have a lot of young people now that are, getting financial advice from advisors. And I think a lot of times now to be able to say, hey, look, like this is a really tough conversation. And even with my friends and my family, I'm having it too, where I'm like, look, guys, I know this is not fun to talk about and it sucks. And it takes some emotional energy to talk through it with your spouse and say, okay, well, what happens in this situation? And especially when I've got friends that are young, that have kids, like you got to have someone that's going to take care of that child, and someone that you know and trust that you can name. And so a lot of times I found just telling them my story and then being like, oh, wow, like this is actually important. And hopefully it doesn't happen to me, but it's not an impossible thing to happen to me. I know has often been it's been really receptive by people.
So you have a number of like estate planning attorneys you connect them with, and you're the CFP. And then do you like give them a checklist of you need these documents, make sure you have your POA, your power of attorney, your will?
Yep. Yeah. So that's typically what we'll do. And then I can just kind of work through them sometimes and say, hey, these are all the things. Like if you have a kid, or multiple children, like you do need to name a guardian in there. So I typically try to work through with people, think through, is there, if you don't have siblings, is there a close family friend that you would trust? Like, do you want your kid to still go to their same school and have their same friends? And maybe it's a really close family friend that lives near you, or maybe it's important that it be a family member. Then maybe the child does have to move, but if that's important, just walking through kind of all of those decisions with people.
And I think, one of the goals of this podcast is to empower the listener so that if something happens, God forbid, that woman, from the knowledge she's heard and the stories she's heard, she feels like that much more prepared and that much more with the different 5 pillars we address. Like she's taken the steps in each area from the wisdom, of all these incredible women that I've gotten to interview. So I love that about your story, because you are definitely helping the women in that area of finances to be more empowered. Because go ahead and tell what we were talking about before the podcast about, the percentages of the men that pass away before the women, and your story, you were in your 20s, but odds are, many people, it is the man who passes before the woman does.
Yeah. So in general, the average age of a widow is 50. And so a lot of times too, like if you ask someone to think of, when they think of a widow, what do they think of? A lot of people think of someone who's much, much older. Like they think of a woman in her 80s or 90s and her husband just passed away, right? It's not typically your 24-year-old that looks like me, or a 40-year-old, or people don't often think of it being a young person, but the average age is 50. And then in the baby mover generation, for instance, 80% of those men will die married. So that just means that 80% of couples in that generation, there's going to be a widow, which is pretty substantial. And, when you think about that generation, those women are the ones that they did a lot of the day-to-day finances, but the husbands, majority, were the ones that did the long-term finances. And so it's so critical that women especially, and I always try to empower my clients that if the men are the only ones coming to meetings, like the wife has to be involved. If at anything, just to know I exist and to call me if something happens, but more so because they need to have a basic understanding. As a woman, you need to know what is going on and have that basic understanding and to be involved, because it is empowering when you know that you're going to be taken care of and that you know what's going on. But also, unfortunately, bad things do happen and loss does happen, or divorce happens, or anything like that can happen. And just being able to be prepared and know that you have the knowledge of what's going on in your financial lives is just really important.
Yeah, that's so good. So good. So talk to everybody about how I just feel like you have a real joyful spirit and you radiate, hope. And I know you talked about wanting to start your own podcast about, to kind of reach out to people who might be going through a season of grieving. So talk to people as you help people. And now you're, a couple of years down the road from when you lost your husband, to encourage the listener who might be going through a really hard time or feel really alone. Like, how has God met you during this time? And how can you encourage someone who might feel like, where is he right now? It feels like I'm all alone. And I'd love for you to just share how you feel like God met you. Maybe it was through people or circumstances. I mean, you shared that on the bridge, which is a beautiful story, but any other way where, someone is looking at their finances or their family situation, just to give them hope that God is there with them.
Absolutely. Well, I just thank you so much for that sweet comment. I mean, it's definitely not me. It's just God that's just shown me hope and joy. So I thank you. But there's been so many instances, I think, where in that early grief, especially, I remember so vividly that I was just, amidst tears, just being like, God, please, like, I don't know what's going on. I don't understand. It's not okay. It hurts. This is terrible. Like, what are you doing? And my youth pastor from high school had reached out, and he told me just something that stuck with me forever. And he's like, it's okay to be angry at God because he can take it. Like, don't let that anger be taken out on other people. Like, be angry at God because you'll understand at some point. Maybe you'll never fully understand. And it's not okay that Scott died. Like, it is sad. But it's okay to be angry, and you have to be angry because it has to come out at some point. So I remember that being a very valuable thing I learned. But through that anger, though, I feel like God really brought me closer to him. And he's like, okay, like, you can be angry at me, but you got to learn about me if you're going to be angry about me and be angry at me. And so it really just provided me an opportunity to just really dig in. And I think I read the book of Job probably 4 times. And I'm like, all right, like, Job really went through it and somehow still came out at the end just with so much hope and joy. And, but he was angry in the midst. Right. And so I just read a lot of Job, and just really dug into making sure I went to church every Sunday. And I took the steps that I could to keep moving forward, because there were a lot of things in that moment that, especially that first year, where there was just a lot out of my control. Like, I couldn't control Scott dying, and I couldn't control a lot of what happened around me at the time. But I'm like, what I can control is where my heart goes, and where do I let my grief just take over me and become just this shell of myself that I did feel like for a really long time? Or do I make Scott proud and make myself proud and just take those little steps? And so I would encourage anyone that's going through anything tough to, Scott was always so good at reminding me of the things that I could control in life. And so I would write down, like, what can I control today? Like, I woke up and I'm like, well, today I'm feeling kind of sad, and I've already cried, and it's 7 a.m. and that's okay. But what can I control today? And then Scott always, every day too, would tell me to think of 3 things I was grateful for. So I would always go through and do 3 things I was grateful for. So for many days, it was the hummingbirds on our porch and the beautiful ferns and the sunshine. But then I would go through and I'd say, okay, what is something that I can control today? And so some days what I could control was simply just getting out of bed and making the bed. And I'm like, okay, well, I accomplished one thing today. Like, getting out of bed before 10 a.m. was an accomplishment. And then some days,
off the list.
yeah. But then some days it escalated, and I was able to go on a walk, and I was able to go do something with friends. And I think increasing that confidence in yourself by just saying, what's one thing or 2 things that I know I can do today that is in my control, it increases your confidence in yourself. And when you can do that, I think it allows you to have more courage to get through those tough things. Because I think when you don't have that confidence, you're just like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. And I just, this is a really large thing I'm looking at. And, there were so many days that there was no light at the end of the tunnel for me. I just looked forward and I'm like, I have no idea how I will ever see hope and joy in the world right now, because I am so angry and this is so terrible. But through just those little things that God was showing me, and just those little acts of gratitude and those little confidence boosters, I was able to be like, okay, like, I got through this day, and I got through another day, and I got through a week, and now I've gotten through a month. And just those little increases of confidence I found were just really helpful. And I'm like, okay, maybe I can't get through this myself, but God's helping me get through this, and my friends are helping me get through this. And sometime in the future, I'm going to look back and I'm going to be able to say, okay, like, I actually can genuinely smile and it'll be okay. So I think just doing those little things for yourself that just boost your confidence, and know, like, okay, I can get through this hour, and I can get through this day, and I can keep going, just those little steps, and trying not to see the big picture, because it can be really scary for sure to be looking at the future and saying, I don't know what's going to happen. And that's okay. But just being like, okay, I can get through today, or I can get through this hour. I think those are really critical.
I think you're so right. And I love having you on this podcast because we always talk about taking that next step. And when we don't take the next step, we allow the circumstances, the fears, the failures, all the things to literally like paralyze and immobilize us. And sometimes it is that simple step, like you said, taking a walk, making the bed. That is what we have in our control. And by doing that, it's, giving us the confidence to say, well, if I can do that, I can also do the next step and the next step. And I think that it's hard. We go through different seasons for sure where it's easier than other times. But if we keep that in front of us as, taking the next step, and then remembering the people who've gone before us have much harder circumstances, situations sometimes than we have, that always really encourages my heart as well. And, I think about, you being in the financial planning industry, and then Janice on the last podcast, and here, at the National Christian Foundation, we are always helping people to look at their finances from more of the generosity side. And I know you mentioned you have a number of clients that they'll, give their money through their donor advised fund, their charitable contributions to NCF. And from the having everything prepared side of things, the will, the succession plan, estate planning, we have a section where when you set up your donor advised fund, you can say, well, if and when I pass away, I want my husband, or, I want my 4 kids to manage this. And then it's really important though, because with NCF, for example, we all of the organizations on our platform, they're always going every 18 months and evaluating them, making sure that they're true to their charters that they were set forth and what they stood for. But when you pass away, you want to make sure like the people that are managing those assets of yours have the same heart, and their choices are going to go toward what, you work so hard to raise that money for while you are here on this earth. So, there's just a component of this succession planning that touches the financial planning side, the charitable giving side. And so I guess I would just like to encourage the listener, if you haven't taken a step yet of thinking, what is going to happen to my assets when I pass away in my Wells Fargo account or in my charitable giving fund, just take a moment and think about it. Don't be, overwhelmed and do nothing, but take that step and you'll be just so much happier. And then once you've done that, you'll feel like, okay, I can do the next step. That's taken care of. I don't have to feel guilty that, I haven't done that. But I know I feel that way when my husband and I are going through our different financial, categories and deciding, okay, let's focus on this, and let's make sure that the house is listed within the trust. And it's those little things that can, really take the time and derail you later. But it's hard, like you said, in the midst of your young marriage, we're all so busy and we're focused on all these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think sometimes too, we just don't like to think about that happening, right? Like we're like, oh, well, if we don't have it figured out, then surely it can't happen. Like it'll happen once we have it figured out. And unfortunately, that's not always how it works.
No, or you see a little, in Southern California, there's so many people get skin cancer. And it's like, oh, that's just a freckle. No, I shouldn't go have it checked out. But check it out. So, okay. What about, I always love to, I know we could talk a long time, but I just think you shared some real pearls of wisdom, and I admire your courage. And I also wanted to share with the listener, because we have talked about women doing well before, that you recently figured out what your two-word purpose statement is. And I think it fits you perfectly. So why don't you go ahead and share what it is and then what your backup one was?
Thank you. Yes, my first 2-word purpose statement, or my primary one, is inspiring hope, which I do love so much because I feel like God provided me so many people that provided me hope and joy through my grief. And so I'm like, if I, what a blessing it would be to me if I could just do that to other people and give them hope in just such a dark time, because we all need hope. And then my second one was cultivating courage, which I did think fit very well with just taking the step to find hope, because I do sometimes think that, when we're in a grief or a traumatic time of our lives, I think we can really just get stuck in the anger and the sadness. And again, I reiterate the fact that you do really, you have to grieve and you have to let yourself feel all the emotions. But I think it can be so debilitating in the sense that you're like, oh, I have to be sad. And life is just, everything's going terribly and it just sucks. But I think too, if you have the courage to just smile every once in a while, and you have the courage to actually have a laugh and not feel bad for it and do all those things, it's really healing. So I thought that was really cool that those were the two purpose
so
statements.
Cool. Well, I want to listen to your podcast when you get it there.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's wrap this up with the 3 areas we touch on, which is your favorite Bible verse, current book that you're reading, and any bargain.
Yes. So my favorite Bible verse is Isaiah 43:2. And so that one has been my favorite since, honestly, 2019, I think, before I ever went through my loss. And it's when you go through deep waters, I'll be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned. The flames will not consume you. And I just find it to be so beautiful, and just no matter what is going on in your life, like it will not consume you. It will not, kind of take you under or derail anything, as long as you just trust in God, which I think is beautiful. And then my book that I'm reading right now is Lemons on Friday. It's by Maddie Jackson Smith. So that's Alan Jackson's daughter. She's also a fellow young widow who was widowed right before the 1-year anniversary of her to her late husband as well. So she's now remarried, though. She has a beautiful restoration story of just how God can repair your heart, and when you're ready, bring someone that can help you continue on forever. But it's just a lot of trusting God through loss, and just a really beautiful book.
Oh, I'm going to read that. I keep getting a really long list after all these podcasts.
Yes, I highly recommend it. And then I would say my bargain, I've been doing Rent the Runway a lot for like work events or weddings or things like that I've been going to. Just really affordable way to wear something really nice and beautiful for really cheap. Yes. And I also have been doing Stitch Fix a lot as well. So my friends that know me know I've been doing Stitch Fix for a long time. Nice. Giving out the referral credits a lot. But I do like Stitch Fix, and just kind of giving me out of my comfort zone, because I do not think that I am a great shopper. I feel like when I go into the store, I don't know what to buy or like what staple pieces I need. I tend to just buy random things. I'm like, I don't really know how they're going to go together, but Stitch Fix is good for that.
And that Stitch Fix, you keep the clothing, right? Whereas
yeah, so they send you 5 pieces, and then if you buy all 5, you get 25% off. But then you send back whatever you don't want. So like if something doesn't fit right, you can get it exchanged, or if you don't like it, you can just send it back. But they do have a preview. They have a preview option now, and so you can pick from different items what you want to be sent.
I know my girls love Rent the Runway, and then also the site Real.
Ooh, I've not heard of that.
They'll have designer, consignment clothing on there, and it's really, you'll get some really, really good deals on there. We have a wedding coming up, so we're exploring all these sites.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look it up.
Well, I loved this time with you. You're so beautiful, and I'm so excited to watch your story unfold as you go forward. And
thank you.
I know you're going to have bright moments of joy to share with the world, to inspire others and continue inspiring hope. And who knows, maybe you'll write a book just like the one that you just, you showed us. I could see that happening too. But just thanks for your courage. Thanks for your vulnerability, your transparency. And I'm just so proud of you for your career, and you're using your skills to also minister to people in the process. So God bless you, and thanks for your time on the Generous Girl podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Kim. It was such a blessing.
All right. Well, take care.
Thank you. You too, Kim.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us today on the Generous Girl podcast. We're so glad that you're here. And if you know of someone that you think needs to be a guest on this podcast, please reach out to us. New episodes are released every other week, and you can follow us on YouTube and on all platforms. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.